Hello. So for this um, assignment, ethical issues as a counseling professional, I chose to address the issue of boundaries. So I read the Munson 2002 article about coloring outside the lines, boundary issues for counselors, which I thought was really interesting. So he prefaces the article with talking about how, we're living in a very unprecedented time for social and economic change and to consider how that impacts boundaries. So this article was written in 2002, and I think it's even more applicable right now in 2020, where this year has been completely very all over the place in terms of how different things have impacted social and economic changes, as well as the boundaries that we've had to have as counselors. So he addresses five different boundary areas. And bear with me, I think I could probably have a vignette for each one of these different boundary areas that he addresses. So he starts by discussing, because he had an earlier article that he referenced throughout his that he wrote in like 1998, where he talks about like the problem definition for counselors. Where previously it would be like only dealing with issues directly related to vocational issues, it would be nothing personal. In terms of space, counseling would be two people facing one another in an office. And in time, it would be continuous dialogue for a set period of time at regular intervals. And then the social context would be professional with formal relationships between the counselor and the client. And in strategies, Amundsen discusses how although information is provided, there wasn't really a lot of exploration. Most of the focus would be like linear, progressive, and rational decision making and action planning. Change is supported through verbal persuasion, not as much like with interventions and different kind of strategies that way. So then Amundsen starts to discuss like looking at these boundaries through an active engagement process. So while these boundaries that he initially lists, the five different areas that counselors have to consider in their counseling practice, he talks about being aware of them first of all, first and foremost, and then having to consider if they're best for you and your client. So in this respect, he starts to discuss how that this can set a stage for creativity and innovation by rethinking many of the counseling boundaries, because obviously these were kind of accepted as standard practice, but maybe they weren't best practice for every client that people were seeing. So again, he kind of goes into the different counseling boundary domains that one has to consider. So with the counseling, with the problem definition, the problem exploration often flows through different phases. So he talks about how, like, when initially you're addressing just vocational issues, obviously the problems that are coming up in that respect kind of bleed over into broader social and economic context. If someone struggles with a substance abuse problem in there, you're seeing it come out because they're like failing to show up for work on time, missing lots of shifts, taking lots of breaks, or different things like that. That's obviously playing out in other respects in their lives. So client base is shifting and becoming more culturally diverse. So the problems wouldn't just be so in that respect, like especially at this time, not just even in just 2002 when this article was written, but talking about how it has to be more, the problem definition has to be more broad in the sense that you're addressing both the career and personal aspect of how the problem is coming, is showing up. And honestly, at this point, the problems that people are having are so much more challenging and more complex than just like, oh, I'm struggling to show up to work on time. It's often way more complicated than that, and there's so many other factors that play into that. So in terms of problem definition, as I've previously talked about, I work in an adolescent residential rehab facility, and oftentimes, someone might come in. I swear, I feel like I get the most challenging cases on my caseload. It's kind of like a building-wide joke that, oh, haha, Mary, it's man, your caseload, you just really get the cream of the crop with the picks. In terms of, we are a short-term residential or a six-week program. Our organization started out as like primary substance abuse related. The mental health aspect of things is much more recent. I want to say it's only like 5 or 6 years that that's really kind of been a focus, and also in terms of having different wings that are specific, different units on wings that are specifically dedicated towards like primary mental health issues. So when we're talking about a 6-week short-term program, oftentimes, especially on the primary mental health unit, we're getting people in there with, issues where they're dealing with suicidal ideation, they're dealing with self-harm, they have the dual diagnosis where they're also using substances to, self-medicate. Some of them might come in with like complex trauma issues where they were, sexually abused when they were younger, and now they're also like binging and purging. And it's like, okay, we only have 6 weeks. What problem do we choose to address first? Like, what is going to be the most beneficial for this person in this 6 weeks period that can kind of address all of the different things that come that are, that all the presenting problems. And obviously on the primary mental health unit, our primary problem definition is usually somehow related to, mental health concerns and wanting to gain like the necessary skills to be able to tackle those things. And then there might be like a second problem statement that addresses, like the substance abuse and coming up with a relapse prevention plan for when they transition out of residential and things like that. However, in terms of a vignette for this specific boundary domain, I have had clients previously, I want to say like one of my probably most difficult clients that I had so far since I've been in residential. It was an 18-year-old client that dealing with suicidal ideation, self-harm, and also struggled with an eating disorder. Obviously a lot more complicated things went into it too. He was also like adopted from Guatemala. His parents were very old compared to him. Like they joked a lot about how they could be his grandparents. So I think in terms of like their relationship with him, they weren't connecting very well. But he would cut himself every time he would eat. And he lost like 10 pounds just while in treatment. And it got to a point where it seemed like the eating disorder was kind of the primary presenting issue at that time. When he wasn't in treatment, he would be using substances instead of self-harming. And when he was using substances, he didn't really care about his weight, so he wasn't doing the binging or purging or anything like that. But again, it got to a really complicated point where since he didn't have substances in treatment, the eating disorder was kind of primary presenting problem. And one of the biggest things as a counselor that you have to know how to do, especially in career counseling, is knowing when to refer out. If your specialty area is not something and that is the primary issue that someone is presenting with, you have to know when it's time to kind of walk away from the client and set them up with somebody that's going to be better equipped to help them. So in this case, again, we're short-term residential. Eating disorder is not something that we are specialized in. It's more substance and like the suicidal ideation, self-harm. I can work with that all day, every day. But the eating disorder stuff can be a little bit more challenging, especially when it's becoming to the point where they're losing weight dramatically while in treatment, because again, it's short term. This is about skill building and setting them up so that they can be successful in the next, phase of their counseling, which would, in theory, we would hope would be like a step down from residential. So if they can't even manage in a residential, sometimes we might have to refer to a more intense kind of program. So that is kind of what I had to do in this instance to solve that issue, because we weren't even able to address the substance use or the mental health at that point because of the eating disorder being so prevalent. The next domain that Amundsen discusses is space, and how counselors have had to expand that boundary from going from just an office and 2 chairs into an assessment of kind of what's available, what's at hand. Sometimes the counselor might be the one that kind of sets this boundary for themselves, where they just kind of prefer to do the office situation. Sometimes it could be the organization that one works with. In my case, where I work right now, there's many different spatial configurations that we can use for both individual and group counseling, and it's honestly kind of encouraged to not just work in your office. So again, I work with adolescents, so we're trying to do groups and individual sessions all over. We have a $3 million garden out back. It's absolutely beautiful and gorgeous. We do different groups out there, different like meditation groups. It's actually called garden meditation. But a lot of times we take the clients out there for group or individual sessions even. Sometimes I have a client right now that struggles with, again, very complex, struggles with the substance use. He was using bath salts. Primary mental health is the diagnosis, though. Major depression with psychosis features. He's heard voices since like 6th grade. And then also self-harms. And then he also has a diagnosis of ADHD, but he is currently unmedicated for the ADHD due to his extensive history of substance abuse. So a lot of times for us, like we'll go on a walk for our individual session. We'll go out to the garden because it just kind of helps keep the focus a little bit better. But that's something that has to be considered, as a counselor. One of the things that Amundsen talks about that I really liked in his article was talking about how flexibility and discernment is needed for effective counseling practice, and that you have to be able to figure out what's going to be best. If I have a client that's a flight risk and actively talking about running from treatment, I'm probably not going to take them individually out to the garden to have a counseling session. A couple of the other domains that he discusses are like the social context, making the client feel safe and comfortable, different guidelines, different cultural considerations in terms of what people need to feel comfortable. He talks about like Aboriginal people, Aboriginal clients, the sharing food and drink is really important kind of thing. Also with direct service, so intervening versus waiting and seeing kind of where things go. I think this happens a lot in residential. Again, I have so many examples that I could give for a vignette that would fit this in terms of, like, I had a client before that struggled with boundaries, struggled with a lot of attention-seeking behavior, and sometimes we would have to just kind of let her engage in what she was doing with the self-harm just to get through it, because every time we were intervening, we were only kind of enabling it, especially when she was doing it like 5 times a day, where it would take so much staff attention and time. And again, this is short-term residential. Like, we kind of have to be at a point where we can kind of manage and self-soothe a little bit on our own. Also, in terms of strategies, this is the last domain area that he discusses. Clients come in with a kind of crisis of imagination. They feel stuck. They have a hard time thinking of new solutions. And so the goal of the counselor is to help find a new vision. He calls them reframing agents, and it's not about just creativity on the part of the counselor, but also about rekindling that with the clients. And I really like more holistic approaches to, helping clients out. So he also talks about like the service economy, how we're moving from just having, service to kind of a creation of memorable experiences, and how that can form the basis for transformation and facilitate change through transformative experiences. He says that the challenge is to create experiences that provide new perspectives and ongoing challenge. So I know I'm like way over my time right now, and I apologize for that, but I just have so many stories that I can talk about with this. Our facility, our organization definitely takes an experimental approach to everything. Building wide, and it's also encouraged with the counselors, which my partner and I really love to do, like different things. Like I said, I never do group on our unit because I just, trying to mix it up. But we have a recovery value of the month, and we do different activities off campus for that. Like we've gone canoeing before, we've played like volleyball downtown, different things, and we always relate it back to recovery values and getting the kids to engage in sober activities that maybe they wouldn't have thought to do, when they were back at home. Like we've gone to like state parks and gone on hikes and like things like that. And things that for a lot of the clients they never would have thought to do. They've been using substances for so long that the idea of going to a national state park and going for a hike or something, it's just not even something they've considered or put on their radar. So sometimes we'll do that. We'll do a different activity like that once or twice a month, and we very much talk about how it's related back to recovery and wellness and being able to engage in activities sober that are enjoyable. So that's another kind of example of vignette, is that we've had, like, I've had a lot of clients that like have never even had a s'more. So when we do like recovery fires, we go over different topics. It would take too long to explain all the different things that we do. But then they have s'mores afterwards. And even something as simple as that, the clients find really enjoyable. And I'm like, wow, like this is something I can do at home. And just, again, trying to relate it back to some kind of recovery value and how they can implement this at home and outside of treatment. But that was kind of boundaries for me. lots of different things that I found really interesting. Again, boundaries in terms of like we're not talking about wavering on different like ethical guidelines, but just talking about different ways to, provide a more holistic approach to therapy, which I thought was really interesting. And I really like that because I think that the organization I work with and how I feel like I am as a therapist definitely encompasses that.